right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this installment of the Summer History Talks from the Arizona Historical Society. I'm Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Manager for the Arizona Historical Society, and I'm so happy to have y'all here with us today. A little bit about the Historical Society. AHS is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution and a state agency established in 1864. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibitions, library and archives, outreach, educational programming, and through publications. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. Our members love Arizona history, and support for programming comes in part from membership dues. So if you like programming from the Historical Society and you'd like to see more of it, consider becoming a member. Members get free admission to AHS museums, special member-only events, and member pricing for programs, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. And you can learn about that at our website, azhs.org/membership. Stay connected with us at the Historical Society. You can sign up for our email list. You can follow us on social media. You can explore one of our museums, and you can learn about all of that and much, much more by visiting us online at azhs.org. Some helpful reminders for today's webinar session. So this is a Zoom webinar. Myself and Dr. Conrad, we can't hear or see you. Please use the Q&A feature for any comments or questions that you have during the course of the presentation. This program will be recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. And if you enjoy this program, again, please consider becoming a member of the Historical Society. The next program in our series, which is next week, I believe, is with Dr. Nick Myers, Rationality, Brutality, and Insanity, Visita General to the Sonoran Frontier. I've included this QR code here. If you've got your smartphone handy and you'd like to scan that for your with your smartphone to register. But you can see this program and all programs in this series and beyond on our website. All right, and now I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Conrad. Dr. Paul Conrad is an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington, and he is the author of the Apache Diaspora, 4 Centuries of Displacement and Survival, which received awards from the OAH, the WHA, and the Historical Society of New Mexico. Those acronyms always trip me up. His current project focuses on the role of Indigenous survivors of the U.S. boarding school system and how their communities were impacted in the first half of the 20th century. So Dr. Conrad, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to all of you in the audience for giving a little bit of your summer afternoon to talk about history. So I'm looking forward to any comments and questions you may have about anything that I talk about today. I'm going to go ahead and share my slide here, and then I will get started. One moment. All right. So I'm going to start today with a couple of images, and I wish I could be in person with all of you, because if we were in person, I would invite your participation and comments on these images. But instead, you're just going to have to hear about them from me. So sorry about that. But I'd like to begin with an image that may be familiar to some of you. It's a photograph by Camillus S. Fly from 1886, titled "Seen in Geronimo's Camp." Fly is famous for being an early photojournalist of sorts, and especially for his photos of Tombstone, Arizona, and the surrounding region, including photos during Geronimo's surrender to the US in 1886. This image, I think, is fascinating for a number of reasons, but I'm sharing it with you today because I think it evokes what popular impressions and historical accounts have long focused on in terms of Apache history, their military resistance to US expansion in the 19th century. And the focus in this photograph on Apache militarism, you see even the young boys there holding guns, was likely an intentional focus of Fly. He was well known for carefully posing his subjects. He made arguments through his photographs. These weren't simply reflections of a real scene. Another image, the second image I want to share with you, is one that is probably less familiar. It is titled Apaches Condemned to the Mines of Mexico. It appeared in a book by Louis Simenon, published in 1867. He was a leading mining engineer and scholar of the 19th century who traveled through northern Mexico to observe its mines. Here we see a quite different image of Apache people than the one in the previous photograph. Here we see them being exploited for their labor, a practice that began centuries before and continued into the 20th century. I began with these two quite different images, one showing military resistance, the other exploitation, because much of my research to date has centered on making sense of the connection between these themes. Popular impressions and historical accounts of Apache history that centered on military resistance are not wrong per se, but they are incomplete. For centuries before Victorio or Geronimo evaded US and Mexican troops, Apache peoples had sought to maintain their independence in the face of Spanish and other colonial powers' efforts to subjugate them through violence, captivity, and enslavement. It was in the Spanish colonial period that Apache communities, especially Southern or Chiricahua Apaches, honed the strategies of raiding, flight, and also diplomacy that they would deploy during the much better known struggles of the US period. So my main message in this presentation today could boil down to a quite simple one, but one that I think is worth repeating. The Spanish colonial period mattered, not as a brief preface to the really important stuff that happened in US history after, but rather on its own terms. It is true that the Spanish exercised limited control over many of the areas they claimed, from California to Florida, and yet Spanish colonialism in what is now the US Southwest was nonetheless influential. If imperial visions often went unrealized, this doesn't mean that the visions were not impactful. We can see this in particular, and as I'll show you today, through some key examples of the history of captivity, forced migration, and enslavement that Apache and other Native people faced. I have limited time, and you all have a summer to enjoy, so I'm going to focus today on three stories, three moments that I think show how exploitation and resistance have gone hand in hand in Apache history. Before I begin, I do want to say just a word about who I am as a person and as a scholar. I am not Apache or Native, but I study Native history because I think it is central to understanding the history of Arizona, the US, and the Americas. We can't understand these places in which we live without recognizing the societies that lived here before and that continue to live and shape our world today. I also am a historian who is drawn most to the stories of ordinary people and their lives. And I think hopefully you'll see that in the material I share with you today, that I'm very interested in focusing as much as I can on individuals and their stories. So we're going to consider these two themes and how they go hand in hand in Apache history through three stories. I'm going to begin with the story of a storekeeper, a merchant's household in the town of Parral in what was then New Spain and now is northern Mexico. We're going to think about what that storekeeper's household reveals about the history of Apache captivity and slavery during that time. Then we're going to move forward to the late 1700s and look at the story of a couple of Apache runaways who were captured near Tucson, Arizona. And then lastly, and more briefly, I'm going to look forward beyond the Spanish colonial period to consider the story of an Apache woman who was a survivor and an activist in the 1920s and 1930s in New Mexico. And her story will show the long-term significance of some of these histories of exploitation and resistance that I'm going to share with you today. All right, we're going to begin back in the 1670s by taking a look at a particular household in a town, this mining town of Parral in northern Mexico. Parral became, like many Western towns, Parral became a booming town after a mineral strike. It was silver that was found in the 1630s that drove a population boom in that area. And it became this town and the mining district around it became a node in the slave trades that crisscrossed the Spanish Empire. African, native, and even Asian slave trades brought labor to various parts of the Spanish Empire, including what's now northern Mexico and the US Southwest. There were various forms of labor in and around the city of Parral, including free wage labor, tribute-based labor systems like repartimiento, as well as forced convict and temporary and permanent enslavement. In a way, we can think of this place as illustrating the complexity and diversity of labor systems in the Americas in a microcosm. So let's begin to enter into this world through a specific source. And what we see here is a baptismal record. Again, if we were in person, I might pick on someone to try to read it. But since you're not allowed to talk, I will lead you through it a little bit myself. On the left there, under the number 2, you'll see the word Swan Indio. Then, much like any baptismal record, for those that you've done who have done genealogical research, you'll be familiar with these. We have the date, the 5th of November, 1679, where the baptism is taking place. Then we're learning who this boy is. The priest says that he baptized Juan, hijo legítimo de Miguel de la Cruz y de Antonia, indios sirvientes de Nicolás de Valderrama. So he baptized this legitimate son of Miguel and Antonia, who are Indian servants of a man named Nicolás de Valderrama. In this record, it describes them only as Indians, but in a number of other records, they are listed as Apache, and that's why I'll refer to them as such today. We get some more information from this baptismal record as well. In addition to learning whose home they are in, Nicolás Valderrama's, we also learn about their godparents, or the godparents of this boy who's being baptized. The godparents who, for those of you familiar with that tradition, are promising to ensure the spiritual education of the boy. Godparents also will often serve a social function in coming to the boy and his family's assistance if needed. The godparents in this case are Miguel and Juana de la Cruz, indios Apache sirvientes, of a priest, the priest. So we gain from this one record a snapshot, a kind of entry point onto the world in which this Indian boy, his Apache parents and Apache godparents live. We see that they're serving, they're laboring in people's homes, that they're forming relationships with each other, and we can then ask questions from this record that might lead us in fruitful directions. So how did these people get here? How many of them were there? How long did Apache people live in this place? All of these kinds of questions Catholic Church records can help us to answer. So building from this one source, I'm going to describe to you what we can learn about this particular household over the course around this time in the 1660s and 1670s in this mining town of Parral. So where how did Apaches end up in northern Mexico, quite distant, in this mining town, distant from their original homelands? This map distills kind of where we're talking about. So Apache homelands in northern Mexico in the present day US Southwest, showing the Royal Road. I think you learned, for those of you who attended a previous talk earlier this summer, I think you learned about the Royal Road, and we can see it leading down to the community of Parral. So for Apache people, northern New Spain and communities like Parral became key destinations for those taken captive in war in what is now New Mexico, Arizona, and surroundings. But it was not the only destination for native captives. Depending on the Apache group and the captors in question, native, Spanish, French, some Apache captives were carried across the plains and up the Mississippi River Valley as far as Quebec. Others ended up among Pueblo, Ute, or later Comanche people. Many more were acquired through military service or purchased and kept in New Mexico household. But hundreds more also were exported to the mining town of Parral and even further south into New Spain. At least part of the reason for them being sent so far away, in addition to the fact that they tended to gain a higher price in these places, so merchants could gain greater profit, was also because of concern, especially in the 1660s and 1670s, about security in New Mexico, and the belief that it was better to send Apache war captives further away to prevent their return to their homelands and their ability to resume assisting their kin in war against the Spanish in New Mexico. In recent decades, we've learned more and more. Before I move on to this, I'll just say that the number of Apaches being transported to Parral was quite significant. Again, it wasn't the only place to which they were carried, but more than 700 Apaches, or people described as Indians from New Mexico, appear in Parral church registers between 1665 and 1680 alone. So in that 15-year period, there's 700 who appear in the records. Of course, that's an incomplete accounting, but it gives a sense of the volume of the trade. 1680, of course, is the year when the famous Pueblo Revolt temporarily shut down this trade between New Mexico and New Spain. In recent decades, we've learned more and more about the importance of Native American slavery in Latin American and American history. Other historians and scholars like Chantel Cramasel, Rick Hendricks, and Gerald Mandel, Denny Seymour, and Andres Resendez have written about this history. But the emphasis of my work has been to seek to add to our understanding of what the experience of displaced Apache and Native people was like, and how their displacement not only influenced their lives, but also the lives of their kin and communities that remained back in their homelands. So how do we piece together this story? As I've already alluded to, one of the most useful tools is Catholic Church records. It's not the most exciting type of research, I promise, but it is important research to carry out. I spent many more months than I would have like to, reviewing all the relevant burial, marriage, and baptismal records from this mining town of Parral in the 17th century in order to try to better understand issues that these kinds of records can shed light on. How many native captives arrived in this area? Who did they marry? Who did they interact with in the town regularly? I wanted in my work to not only get at the tragedy of this story, the short life expectancy, the abuses that servants and slaves often suffered, but also to allow for and to talk about other possibilities, the possibilities of friendship, love, survival that we can see in these records as well. By combining all the different types of records that we have access to, so Catholic Church records, court records, notarial records, anything that has survived from this place in archives, we can start to piece together the story of the community, and also more specifically, the story of this storekeeper's house. And for me, I found it useful to have something to latch on to tell this story. So by moving from this particular person's house and those that lived within it, I then sought to shed light on broader themes. So Nicolas Valderrama, the man whose house it was, who purchased various servants and slaves over the course of his life, Nicolas Valderrama was born in Mexico City in the 16 teens in 1615. And he came north to Parral after the silver strikes there in the 1630s. Perhaps smartly, he started a store rather than trying his hand at mining. For those of you familiar with the history of mining strikes, you may know that miners often don't fare as well as merchants who make a lot of money by selling goods to miners at inflated prices. That was certainly true in California, and it was true in Parral as well. By the 1650s, the storekeeper had purchased his first Apache slave to help him, a boy that he named after himself. He named this boy Nicolas. Valderrama got married, he had children, he purchased more, both Apache and African slaves to attend his business and home. Through Catholic Church records, as well as some of his business records and will and testament, I know that he had at least 18 Apaches and 6 enslaved Africans living in and laboring in his estate over time. His estate consisted of his store, several houses, and a corral on the outskirts of town. From his will, I can tell you that the main house was decorated with a bust of St. Nicholas and 6 painted hides from New Mexico. And it was furnished relatively modestly. It had a table and chairs, some beds and mattresses, desks, a table. His wealth was not insignificant, but neither did it place him among the wealthiest class of Parral residents. He was, in other words, fairly ordinary. And I think it's in that ordinariness, so to speak, that his household makes for a very interesting window onto this community and what lives for Apache people in it were like. Let me tell you a little bit more about the couple whose child was baptized in that record that I shared with you a few minutes ago. Miguel and Antonio, I know, began to serve in Valderrama's home in the 1660s. That's probably where they met. And they got married then in 1667 and had a child the following year who died a few months after his birth. Juan, the boy in the baptismal record I showed you, was their next child, their second son. They christened their third son, Gregorio, in May of 1683, so a few years later, but had already buried him by November. 2 years after that, the couple had yet another son, Jose, whose godparents at his christening included a prominent Parral resident. In some, death we can see was commonplace, but there were also moments of joy and hope. And Apaches in this community forged connections to help them survive, both with each other and with other exploited people, such as free and enslaved people of African descent. So I've detailed so far, I think a story of exploitation. The one side of that theme that I'm wanting to highlight with you today as being a key part of Apache history. But I'll also at least briefly talk about resistance. So Apache servants and slaves in Parral responded to their circumstances through means you might expect. They ran away, they returned their master's violence with violence. They formed relationships that helped them to survive. Records here show that an Apache identity persisted for at least a few generations, at least in part due to continued arrivals in the town, as well as the relatively large population of Apaches in the town that persisted over time. The story of any history like this, however, is not just about the people sent away, but also about those who remain behind. And that also, I think, is where we see this link between exploitation, captivity, enslavement, forced migration, and resistance, militarism coming together. The communities from which Apache captives were separated were deeply shaped by this slave trade. In this particular period, for example, Apache retaliation for Spanish slave raiding in the 1660s and 1670s often then justified further Spanish slaving and capture of Apache people, leading to further loss. In other words, Apache communities did maintain their autonomy and their independence in their homelands, but this autonomy came at a great cost, as we see from the hundreds of Apaches captives displaced south into lives of labor in New Spain. I want to turn now to our second story, to another moment, another example where we see exploitation and resistance and its importance in Apache history and in Spanish, in the history of the Spanish colonial period. While temporarily interrupted by the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 that temporarily removed the Spanish from New Mexico, the Spanish capture and displacement of Apache and other native people from the Southwest continued in the 18th century. The circumstances and destinations, though, shifted. As an entry point into this history, I want to again begin with the stories of some specific people and with a specific source, and then I'll zoom out from there to talk about the broader context. And here we're going to begin with some testimony taken from two Apache runaways. This kind of source is an example of what for a scholar is kind of like a gold mine, a moment of, sometimes you spend all this time in the archive and don't find anything, and then you have a day where you find something like this, and it's like, wow, I can keep going. So what we see here, it reads, I'll just translate into English, the declarations taken from two Apaches that had fled from the coffles that were conducting them to Mexico. And their testimony is taken through an interpreter. The first question you see here where it says preguntado is, by what name were you known in your land, and what is your name? I've always found that to be a really interesting question. And of course, for Apache and other native people living in this time and place, they often were known by multiple names. Of course, their Apache names within their own community, names that the Spanish gave them, and so on. So he responds that in his country, in his land, he's known and was known as the Green One, El Verde, but the soldiers who took him away in a coffle gave him the name Miguel, and that's how they knew him. So this document then goes on to describe the remarkable story of these two runaways, who had been captured by the Spanish military in war at that time between the Spanish and independent Apache communities. As was typical in this period of time, Apaches that were taken captive, taken as prisoners of war, were sent away from the northern frontier or the Southwest. They were shipped south to Mexico City, to the Gulf Coast, to Veracruz. And by the 1790s, by this time, they were routinely also being shipped to Havana, to Cuba. As was true in some previous moments, the justification, the explanation for this was in large part concern about security, about their ability to return north. And the hope was that by sending them far enough away from home, they would not try to escape, not try to continue resistance against the Spanish, but would be able to be put to work and provide useful labor to the Spanish Empire. For more than 2,000 Apaches sent away during this period, they didn't often just give in to Spanish hopes here, as we learn from the story of El Verde and his companion, whose name is Disoque. These two men had escaped from one of these coffles conducting Apache prisoners of war to the Gulf Coast. They'd returned north. They described how they had been recaptured and then sent south again, and had managed to escape a second time and return back north until an Apache leader, El Vivara, had found them in the mountains near Tucson and had decided to turn them into the Spanish because he knew that they were people that had been sent away by the Spanish before as prisoners of war, and he knew the Spanish would want them. So this story of these two runaways, again, I think provides a specific entry point on to a broader story of captivity and forced migration, its links to resistance, and how that has shaped Apache and Southwest history. Here we see, this is late in the colonial period, how the Spanish are still desperately trying to subjugate Apache communities and gain sovereignty, gain control over lands that they had long claimed but not actually controlled. And they're devising creative and deadly schemes to try to make that happen, including orchestrating an expensive and difficult effort to deport Apache prisoners of war, hundreds of them, to distant lands, in the hopes that this effort would lead Apaches that remained in the Southwest to ally with the Spanish, lay down their arms, and agree to live in peace with Hispanic communities. What we learn, I think, from this story is that this was not only, of course, traumatic for those who lived through it, many of whom died en route to their destinations or upon arrival in places like Havana, but it was also a very difficult moment for those that remained behind, both because they saw their own kin being sent away, who they of course missed, but also because it raised questions for them about how they were going to protect their families. In the case of this Apache leader who turned in El Verde and Disoque, he did so not so much because he had anything against them, but rather because he had made the decision to ally with the Spanish in the hopes of protecting his own family and his own larger family group, extended family community with which he lived. So we see in this moment in the latter part of the 1700s and early 1800s, again, how captivity and forced migration, which the Spanish justified due to Apache resistance to Spanish rule, led to the displacement of a large number of Apache people who were, for those who survived, were forced to figure out how to survive and live out new lives, not in circumstances they had chosen, places like Havana or Veracruz. But we also see how it influenced the politics and social relations among Apache communities that were not sent away, influencing their strategies of resistance, and also their decisions around diplomacy and alliance as a part of efforts to try to protect their communities. And by the early 1800s, many Apache communities had decided to enter into peace agreements with the Spanish. These agreements, as the historian Matt Babcock has shown, in some ways resembled the reservations of the US period, in which Apaches received at least some level of food and supplies in exchange for agreeing to aid the Spanish army in campaigns against Apache groups that remained outside the alliance with the Spanish, that system, though rooted in a period of violence and death and destruction, did serve for a period of time in reducing the violence between Apache and Hispanic communities in this region. This, just to give you a little more of a sense for those of you not familiar with this history, this slide shows the landscape along the road to Veracruz, where these men, El Verde and Disoque, escaped and traveled hundreds of miles back north to the vicinity of Tucson. In the end, having been sent away and escaped and sent away and escaped, they traveled several thousand miles in a few years' time. A really remarkable testament of the determination of Apaches to return home despite Spanish efforts to permanently exile them. This is the castle of San Juan de Ulua, where Apache captives were housed before being shipped to Havana. At least 500 Apaches are documented to have been shipped from San Juan de Ulua to Havana during this period, the 1780s, 1790s, and first years of the 1800s. I want to look forward now. In what I've discussed with you so far, I've tried to show the importance of native captivity and enslavement during the Spanish colonial period, how the lives of those displaced were deeply affected by this experience, and how they sought to survive in difficult circumstances, and including through forming relationships with each other and with other exploited people. And I've tried to begin to show how that also influenced Apache communities left behind, who sought to end captive and slave trades through military resistance, but in some cases fueled further captivity. And their efforts to maintain autonomy and independence were, in the end, successful, though they came at this great cost. Looking forward, many of these same dynamics would continue in the US period. I've mentioned already how the US reservations in some ways resembled earlier efforts in terms of diplomacy between the Apache and the Spanish to reach agreements of coexistence in which Apaches would live in particular areas and receive rations and food and supplies in exchange for peace. The U.S. sought to also sought to kind of create a similar system, even though they weren't necessarily familiar with the Spanish efforts that had occurred in the past. But Apache diplomats were. And I think when we look at some of the commonalities between the US and the Spanish period, we have to consider the fact that even if the U.S. and U.S. officials were not always familiar with what had happened before during the Spanish colonial period, Apaches had passed down stories of not only these moments of exile and displacement, but also the strategies through which they had sought to survive it. I want to move forward now to considering a period in Apache history that very much echoes the histories in the Spanish colonial period that I've shared with you so far today. And I'm going to do so again by looking at a specific person and a specific source that opens a window onto this period in Apache history in which exploitation and resistance were linked, and Apache communities were deeply affected by colonial efforts to end their autonomy and ship them far from home. This document is a portion of an affidavit that Helen Chato gave in 1929. Helen Chato was the wife of Chato, who some of you may be familiar with as a well-known Apache leader in the late 1800s. Chato and his kin were among those that the United States rounded up as prisoners of war and shipped to Florida after Geronimo's surrender in 1886, and then interned in Alabama before sending them to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. And I found Helen Chato's perspective on this period in Apache history to be really striking. She talks about this moment in which Apaches, many of whom had been aiding the US military, much like Apaches generations in the past had sometimes aided the Spanish military. Many Apaches have been aiding the US military in trying to track down Geronimo and others who were continuing their mobility in Mexico. She says, back in Arizona, they meaning the US, took the faithful Indians who had also been doing valuable service and had helped to run down Geronimo. They were put under guard by the very troops with which they had been campaigning. They put them in escort wagons, took them to Holbrook, Arizona, and shipped them to St. Augustine, Florida. These Indians were raised in New Mexico and Arizona. Now they placed them in a St. Augustine prison. They never were used to the climate. They had to drink filthy water, such as sewer pipe water, and this caused many deaths in St. Augustine. She goes on to talk about, what happened when they got to Alabama. She describes them as being worked like slaves, and she describes how many died due to the climate. She ended her affidavit by saying, we are created by the same one the white people were created by. In his presence, they have abused us. So Helen Chato, like others of her generation, had again lived through a period of captivity, of trauma, suffering, exploitation. But it was also a period of resistance. We can see that in Apache efforts to survive. They sent money. So relatives that had remained behind in Arizona and New Mexico sent money to those that had been shipped away. They wrote letters back and forth to their children who were sent away to boarding school. And very importantly, they campaigned against the US to seek their release from prisoner of war status, mobilizing any allies they had, such as military officers that had been familiar with them. And in this affidavit, Helen Chato and those of her generation were seeking, a further form of redress from the United States. In the 1920s, they began a campaign to obtain reparations from the US government for what they viewed as their wrongful internment as prisoners of war in Florida and elsewhere for 27 years. And, among the affidavits that former prisoners of war gave in this period. I think Helen Chato's is one of the most striking for the vivid descriptions of what captivity and exile had been like for her and her kin, how many had died as a result, but also how at least some of them had managed to survive, regroup, and seek to rebuild their communities. I'm going to go ahead and conclude because I want to leave some time for your comments and questions, but I end here just again thinking back to the Spanish colonial period, thinking back to the 1600s and 1700s, and then looking forward to the late 1800s and early 1900s, where I've ended with Helen Chato. I think I've hopefully illustrated the depth of this history of displacement and forced migration, and Apache efforts to survive and regroup across not only the Spanish colonial period, but continuing through the US period into the present. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Conrad. We've got a bunch of questions, and I'm going to do my best to organize them thematically. But keep those questions coming if you've got questions that you would like addressed. So there's a lot of questions regarding slavery, enslavement, those kinds of things. So one of the first questions is, did the number of Pueblo slaves in Parral outnumber Apache slaves in Parral?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'm seeing the range of questions and letting them kind of soak in for a second. So in terms of, that's an easy one to start with. So this is a really tricky issue, and in my larger book, I try to make clear that it's difficult to know for sure the tribal affiliations of all the native captives that end up in a place like Parral. So from various records, I'm confident that people that we would now call Apache and Navajo were very well represented among those that were sent south. But there's little question that people from other tribal affiliations also were sent south, including people from Pueblo communities, including people from various Plains tribes, including Utes, and there's really a range of people that ended up in Parral. And in the records in Parral, unfortunately, there's not a lot of distinction that's made in tribal affiliation. What you see typically in the records is either Apache or Indian from New Mexico. And so it's difficult to really answer precisely that question of how many natives were Pueblo or from Plains tribes versus Apache or Navajo. So I think the really important thing, I guess, to stress is that there were people from a broad swath of the Southwest that ended up in captivity and being sent south in these slave trades. And let's see here. Let me see. I'm seeing some questions about the this kind of second period I talked about. So so the first, so these coffles or chain gangs the question is, was it an actual chain gang? So were captives actually, chained together? The answer to that is it varied based on the route. So generally, from northern New Spain to Mexico City, all of the captives were not actually chained together. They were marching on foot with an escort of soldiers. Sometimes male captives were chained, but not women and children. In the march from Mexico City to Veracruz, it was much more common that they were actually all chained, in part because of some high-profile escapes that happened on that route. So I guess the short answer is sometimes they were actual, kind of chain gangs or coffles, and not just a word meant to describe kind of a group of captives being escorted somewhere. Which viceroy attempted to deal with them once and for all? That's a good question. I wish I could. There were a number of viceroys that were involved in dealing with Apache relations, and so there's not. I can't give you just one answer in terms of which how we would say which viceroy that was. There was a number. I mean, the going back, it became routine for Apaches to be sent south in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. We see this continuing. It's really not until the independence wars break out in the 18 teens that this practice shuts down. I think it's a policy that's carried forward by a number of viceroys, and the innovations are sometimes more about destination. So moving from just sending them to Mexico City, for example, to sending them to Havana. And I wish I could tell you offhand which viceroy that was, but I don't have the name on the tip of my tongue. But if you send me an email, I can definitely let you know. It's interesting you say one of your ancestors, Agustin Islas. That name rings a bell for me. It's someone who may appear in records that I've looked through. So even more reason to send me an email if you're interested, because I can search through my research and see if I have someone by that name in my material. Let's see here. In New England, we read of people taken by natives who decide to stay rather than return home. Was there voluntary staying with enslavers among Apaches, and how much intermarriage is there? That question's from Vera Marie. Thank you. That is a great question, and I think so. The answer I would give is that yes, you see voluntary staying, so to speak, and I think at least part of that is that children were very well, and many of these captives were children. So it's one of the questions that I hope to answer in terms of my research about Parral was about the age of captives sent there. Unfortunately, the records are just not descriptive enough to I don't have a huge sample size of the records that list an age that would really allow for me to say that. But for the records that do list an age, and I can tell that they're relatively recent arrivals, it's under age 10. It's a quite young age. So if you can imagine, if you're a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old, and you grow up in a particular household, even if you're mistreated and you're exploited, if you gain your freedom, where do you go? And for many, especially if they're captured at a very young age, there's not necessarily knowledge of where their home community is now to be able to escape and return home. So what often people would do is try to better their circumstances, even if it didn't mean actually returning home to their kin. There's one example that really stuck with me of a woman, if I remember correctly, her name was Maria Guadalupe, but she was taken to Mexico City by one of the governors of New Mexico. It wasn't uncommon that governors of New Mexico in the 17th century would take native captives back with them to Mexico City or ship them south as well. And there's a woman who, for various reasons, ends up in Inquisition records suing for her freedom. And what this Apache woman says is, I've been laboring for more than 10 years, and I know that I therefore should gain my freedom. And, I would like to be able to serve a master of my own choosing. And there's really interesting things about this document. Technically, legally, she wasn't allowed to be enslaved for any term, but clearly she had ingrained this idea that she could be enslaved for a period of time. But then also, again, instead of seeking to return back to New Mexico or to Apache lands, she's looking to find a better labor circumstance where she'll be paid and she'll be treated better. So I think that's an example of, I guess, echoing what the comment is saying about New England, where we do see people staying voluntarily, and intermarriage. I know I've rambled on for a bit about this, so I'll stop. But intermarriage is also a factor. When you have, it's quite common that Apaches would marry people of African descent who may be enslaved, and so even when during certain anti-slavery campaigns, they're told they're free and so on, the Apaches, they remain in those households. And I think intermarriage and those social relationships and kinship relationships are a key part of that. Did Opatas help as auxiliaries? Yes, they definitely did. The Spanish rely quite a bit on native allies, including Opata people, in campaigns against Apache people. They also, as I talked a bit about, try to gain the assistance of Apaches against other Apaches. Sometimes this is one Apache group that views itself as distinct from another and using them. But there are cases in which Apaches serve as auxiliaries or scouts against members of their own communities. And I know those are, for some of those people, those were difficult choices, but we have to keep in mind, I think, the history of violence and captivity and how they're really responding to that in their decision-making and trying to protect themselves and their families in some cases. Did the Apaches ever hold slaves? Yes, they did, though the evidence is that the Apaches, with captives that the Apaches took, there's not a lot of evidence of them having a kind of larger group of forced laborers within their communities in the same way that the Spanish or even some other native groups did. The captives they took tended to be integrated into the group over time. In terms of, so that's particularly true in terms of boys, girls, children. Adult men would be more likely to be killed than taken captive and returned with them to Apache communities. The short answer is yes, they did take captives. They did sometimes exploit the labor of captives, but it was more common that rather than maintaining that status for a longer period of time, that captives would either be integrated into the group or exchanged for Apache people that were being held captive by the enemy group in question, whether it was Comanches, the Spanish, Pueblo groups. So all of these people kind of took captives from each other at different points in time. Where that goes. So let's see here. So local natives in Parral, yes. Going back to the beginnings of Spanish colonization, the variety of indigenous peoples in that region, including Tepehuanes, for example, were sometimes taken captive and enslaved. This was particularly true in cases of war, where even, despite certain royal prohibitions, the Spanish tended to have a cultural sanction for enslaving war captives, enslaving members of native groups that were resistant to Spanish rule. So we definitely see that happening in and around Parral, but especially in the period prior to the silver strikes that lead to this community being created and growing up. So in this later period, the local native population would more likely, was a part of draft labor system. So this is basically because they had been conquered by the Spanish, they had to pay tribute. One of the ways in which they pay tribute is through labor for a certain period of time per year. So there was that way in which they labored. Then there was also wage labor, in which local native people would sometimes work for wages as well. Let's see. So the other questions here, were there documented instances of other indigenous tribes aiding or fighting against Apache communities? Yes, so I think I've kind of already addressed that one, but there were definitely, as in the case of the commenter that talked about the Opata, Tarahumara as well, which are known as Raramuri today. They also aided the Spanish against Apaches. So there's definitely the Spanish are relying upon native allies in warfare against the Spanish, against the Apache quite a bit. The origins of the Nihora. I've seen the term Nihora mentioned a lot in baptismal records. That's a question. So there are a number of good articles that my own research hasn't focused on that on the Nihora. There's a number of historians that have and have written about that term and people that appear, especially in Sonora records. I think, as in the case, my sense, it's been a little while since I read that scholarship in depth, but my sense is it's somewhat similar to the case of the term Apache that appears in other places, where it's a cover term that encompasses people of varied tribal origins. So I would imagine, I think that varied peoples are encompassed in that term, which is associated with enslavement. So it's kind of becomes a term that indicates the servitude and subjugation of native people and that status in the households in Sonora and Arizona. But that's a great question. I think we see these regional dynamics all across the Spanish Empire, in which there's in these kind of frontier or borderlands areas, there's specific native groups that tend to be subjected to enslavement. We see certain terms arise to describe their condition that gets applied to them. And Nihora is an example of that in Sonora and Arizona. All right. Well, I thank you all for listening and for your questions. It was my pleasure to share a little bit of my work with you. And I look forward to future programming and being an audience member next time and getting to ask questions. So
thank you so much for your time this afternoon for us in the Southwest, this evening for you, Dr. Conrad. We hope to see you for the next installment of the series, and take care, everyone. Have a nice day.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.